Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I parked 2 blocks away on purpose, mostly because I didn't want them watching me pull up in a rented Ford Fusion instead of something flashier like Brian's stupid lifted Dodge or Allison's white Lexus that Dad helped her finance when she graduated. I walked the rest of the way in the cold March wind, clutching the small manila envelope in my jacket pocket and rehearsing what I'd say if the timing felt right. That envelope had been burning a hole in my coat for weeks, but I hadn't touched it until this morning. 30 years. 3 full decades of being told I was doing it wrong. Too quiet. Too strange. Too free. And today, they were going to sit across from me and pretend everything was just fine, as if I hadn't been the invisible one all these years. The restaurant was one of those mid-tier Italian places with overly enthusiastic waiters who act like every dish is a family secret passed down since the fall of Rome. When I walked in, I saw them already seated at the long table near the back. My mom waved too hard, like I might miss them in the half-empty dining room. My sister gave me a quick half-hug that smelled like coconut body spray and thin patience. Brian clapped me on the back with enough force to knock the sarcasm loose from my spine. "Look who finally made it to 30 without getting someone pregnant or arrested," Brian said, grinning like he'd just won something. My dad gave a short chuckle, the kind that barely reached his chest. He didn't stand up. That was classic dad, respect earned, not given. And apparently I hadn't earned much. They had balloons tied to one of the chairs. The gold 3 and 0 twisted lazily in the air-conditioning draft like they were mocking me. Mom insisted on taking pictures with her old iPhone that had a cracked screen and a photo album full of other people's milestones. The waiter came, and orders were taken. I kept it simple: grilled chicken over pasta with no cream sauce. I didn't plan on staying long enough to need leftovers. Once the small talk ran dry after they asked about the weather in Arizona, which I hadn't been in since December, and whether I was still doing the podcast thing, my dad leaned back in his chair and pulled something from the inside pocket of his coat. It was a card. Not the kind you buy last minute at Walgreens, but one of those fancier types with embossed lettering and a glittery border that made it look like it had something important to say. He slid it across the table without looking at me directly. I didn't open it right away. I knew how these things worked. There was always a punchline. "Thought you'd appreciate the message," he said, voice like gravel stuck in a throat of pride. Brian snorted into his drink, already half a beer in. "Don't take it too hard, man. We're just saying, it might be time to stop chasing dreams and plant your feet somewhere." Allison didn't say anything, just sipped her wine and stared off to the side like she was already regretting the drive down from Allentown. I opened the card slowly, letting the anticipation stretch out like a pulled rubber band. Inside, in my mother's familiar cursive, it read, "It's time to grow up and settle down. We love you, but it's time." There was no money inside. Not that I expected it. I looked up at them, one by one, taking in the self-satisfied expressions. The kind of look people give when they think they've said something wise, something final. Brian raised his glass toward me, smirking. "To 30 years of figuring it out, huh?" I smiled. It wasn't a fake smile either. It was calm, deep. The kind of smile that comes right before a magician pulls off the trick he's practiced 100 times in the dark. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. No theatrics, no build-up. Just tapped the screen and scrolled for what I needed. "You know," I said, "I've actually been looking forward to this dinner." "Oh yeah," my dad said, chewing the edge of his lip like he wasn't sure where I was going. "That's a first." "Yeah," I said, "because I've got something I've been saving for today. And I think you'll all want to hear it." I set the phone on the table between the wine glasses and the bread basket, leaned back in my chair, and pressed play. And that was the moment the whole damn tone of the evening changed. It started with a click, then a dial tone, and finally a woman's voice, clear, professional, recorded just 2 weeks ago. She said my name, confirmed the closing date, confirmed the wire transfer, and welcomed me officially as the new owner of the house at 408 Maple Hill Lane. Silence. The kind of silence you only hear right after a crash or right before someone starts shouting. My mom blinked fast, like she'd misheard. Brian's jaw tilted a few degrees to the side, confused. My dad sat still, not breathing, staring at the device like it had just announced the second coming of Christ, and he wasn't invited. I let the silence hang for a moment longer before speaking. I bought the house, I said simply. The house. Your house. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't fidget. I wasn't nervous. Not anymore. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, lying awake in cheap motels with my laptop open and a pile of regrets stacked like soda cans beside the bed. You what? My mother said finally, her voice thin, like someone trying to whisper through static. I leaned forward. I bought the house. Legally. Through a third-party holding company. Closed last week. You should be getting the paperwork any day now. My father opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "Why would you do that?" And I smiled again. That same calm, steady smile. Because the truth was, I'd been waiting 3 decades for that question. And I finally had the answer. Let me play you something I've been saving for today. Ever been treated like a disappointment your whole life, then suddenly become the only one holding the cards? Because that was the exact moment it happened for me, and let me tell you, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like surgery without anesthesia. Necessary, painful, and years overdue. When I pressed play on that recording, the air at that table went still like someone had pulled a power cord straight out of the wall. My father's eyebrows twitched ever so slightly, his posture stiffened like a soldier waiting for impact, and Brian's stupid smirk slid off his face like warm cheese off cold pizza. "Hello, Mr. Keller. This is Janet from Pioneer Title Services," came the crisp, cheerful voice from my phone speaker, echoing through the restaurant's low buzz of conversation and clinking dishes. "Just confirming we've received the final wire transfer for the property on Maple Hill Lane. Congratulations and welcome. Your ownership documents will be mailed within 3 to 5 business days. If you need anything else, feel free to call us. Again, thank you for choosing us." The click of the recording ending felt louder than it had any right to be. No one spoke. Not at first. The birthday banner hanging above us, sloppily tied to the curtain rod, drooped a little lower, like it too was ashamed to be part of the celebration. My mother's mouth was open but silent, as though she was searching the room for the script and couldn't find it. Brian looked at Dad, then at me, then at the phone, like he expected someone to jump out and yell "Gotcha" from behind the breadsticks. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the white linen tablecloth, calm as a surgeon mid-procedure. "That was dated 8 days ago," I said, voice low but clear, slicing through the awkward tension like a clean blade. "The house is in my name now. You can check the county registry if you don't believe me. Hell, wait a few days and the papers will show up in your mailbox." Dad was the first to make noise, but it wasn't a word. It was that low, guttural sound he always made when something broke inside him, but he didn't want to let it show, like when the car stalled in traffic or when Brian totaled the lawnmower trying to do donuts in high school. He reached for his napkin, dabbing at his forehead though there was no sweat. "Why?" he finally said, his voice slow and heavy, the word carrying more weight than it ever had. I could have said a lot of things right then. I could have told him it was revenge, or a statement, or some poetic act of reclaiming childhood. But the truth was, I wasn't entirely sure myself. The reasons were complicated, messy, emotional. Like most things in families that pretend everything's fine while stepping over elephant-sized resentment in the living room. "You'll understand in a minute," I said instead, letting the words hang. But I think it's about time I explained how we got here. The silence after that was different. Not confusion anymore. Anticipation. Like they knew something was coming and couldn't decide whether to flinch or brace themselves. What none of them understood yet was that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This wasn't the act of a bitter man trying to rub their faces in some success. This was a plan years in the making, a slow burn reaction to a lifetime of being told I didn't quite measure up. I didn't go to the right college, didn't choose the right job, didn't want the right kind of woman, didn't shave close enough, or vote conservative enough, or talk loud enough at family barbecues. I sat across from the people who raised me, and for the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel like a goddamn question mark. I was the one with answers. With proof. With a deed in my name and a recorded voice confirming what they thought could never be true. Brian scoffed suddenly, leaning back in his chair like he was trying to get a better view of the spectacle. "This is some kind of stunt, right?" he said, but his voice cracked halfway through. "Like, you hacked something? Got someone to fake it?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The documents were real. The transaction was legal. Every I was dotted, every T crossed by someone who gets paid way too much per hour to risk a fraud charge. The look I gave him said it all, and he sank back, folding his arms like a child who just realized Santa wasn't coming. Allison, who'd been silent until now, finally cleared her throat. "You seriously bought Mom and Dad's house?" she asked, her voice somewhere between disbelief and genuine curiosity. "Yeah," I said. "And you know what the funny part is? They were planning to sell it anyway. But not to me. To help cover Brian's gambling debt." Brian's head whipped around. "You told him," he barked at my dad, face flushing. "I didn't tell him anything," Dad growled, but there was guilt in his voice, like a dog caught chewing through a locked cabinet. "You left the phone on speaker," I said coolly. "I stopped by the house when no one was home to drop off Mom's birthday gift. Heard the whole conversation while I was in the hallway. Didn't even know you were talking about selling it until that moment." Mom reached out as if to say something, then pulled her hand back like it might burn her. Her eyes were glossy, but I couldn't tell if it was from betrayal or embarrassment. "You all had a plan," I said. "And none of it included me. I was never part of the solution, just the disappointment you didn't want to deal with." The waiter came by to check on us, probably sensing the weird tension, like a storm cloud hanging over our booth. I waved him off with a polite nod, and he disappeared quickly, grateful to escape the blast zone. "Look," I said finally, "I didn't come here to throw it in your faces. I came here to take back something that mattered to me. The house doesn't just belong to you, it belonged to me too. Every scrape on the stair railing, every nail I hammered into that crooked treehouse, every argument in that kitchen about who left the milk out. I lived there. I bled there. And I was done letting people make decisions about it like I never existed." They didn't answer. They didn't know how. And honestly, I didn't expect them to. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stood slowly. Not out of drama, just readiness. I had more to say, but I needed them to be ready to hear it. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," I said softly. "But if the only way you'd ever hear me was by buying the roof over your heads, well, now I've got your attention." I paused for a moment, looking at the table like it might speak back. "Let me explain how we got here." The first time I realized I was different from the rest of my family, I was 8 years old, sitting cross-legged in the attic with a flashlight between my knees, flipping through a box of old maps I'd found buried beneath water-damaged yearbooks and a broken slide projector that hadn't worked since Reagan. It was the kind of moment no one else ever saw, because no one else ever came looking. While Brian was out back learning how to throw a perfect spiral under Dad's squinting approval, and Allison was inside taking piano lessons from a woman who smelled like peppermint and mothballs, I was upstairs, tracing the ghost roads of old America with my fingertip and pretending I could feel the past breathing through the paper. No one ever asked me what I liked back then, not really. They asked what sports I wanted to try, what clubs I wanted to join, which friends I was hanging out with, and when I said none, they said I'd grow out of it. When I said I liked reading about the Great Depression, they looked at each other like they'd found a roach in their cereal. It wasn't just weird, it was inconvenient. Because weird meant different, and different meant harder to explain at church cookouts and parent-teacher nights. At school, I kept my head down and my backpack zipped tight, a fortress against the kids who sensed I wasn't built the way they were. I didn't talk much, and when I did, it was usually about something no one else cared about. Did you know Pennsylvania has more ghost towns than any other state east of the Mississippi? I did. But no one else wanted to. That's not the kind of fact that gets you invited to sleepovers or pizza parties or the cool end of the lunch table. That's the kind of fact that gets you called professor in that tone kids use when they're trying to laugh you into silence. At home, the difference became its own kind of wallpaper, always there, but no one really saw it anymore. Dad would come home from work, grease still on his hands, and talk to Brian about football drills or weight training, never once asking me how my day was. Mom would ask if I'd eaten, if I'd done my homework, but the questions were always functional, like she was running down a checklist, not raising a son. Allison was polite enough when she remembered I existed, but even she once said I was like a little ghost who lives in the house. That one stuck with me. Birthdays came and went like mail that was never opened. My gifts were always off-brand Lego sets or books about animals because someone remembered I liked nerdy stuff, and when I didn't jump up and down with excitement, they told me I was ungrateful. Brian got dirt bikes, baseball gloves, and a framed photo of him and Dad shaking hands at the end of a state championship game. I got a pat on the back and a reminder to smile more. They weren't cruel, not exactly. But they weren't curious either. And sometimes, the absence of curiosity hurts worse than cruelty. Because cruelty at least means someone noticed you long enough to push. I remember once, during dinner, I started talking about the Dust Bowl. I just read this incredible chapter about how entire towns vanished into the wind, swallowed by dirt storms and poverty, and how families packed everything into rickety trucks and drove west with nothing but hope in the glove box. I was halfway through explaining how the government set up camps for migrants when Dad put his fork down, looked at me, and said, "What the hell are you gonna do with all that useless crap, Josh? Ain't no money in dead towns." Everyone laughed. Except me. That was the moment something inside me clicked, like a switch flipped in the dark. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even sadness. It was recognition. A quiet little voice that said, "They'll never get it. Stop trying to make them." After that, I stopped volunteering information. I stopped sharing the little things that made me feel alive. My thoughts became internal, like echoes in a cave no one else visited. I started talking less, writing more, keeping journals filled with dates and facts and questions I didn't know how to ask out loud. Middle school was more of the same. Brian had girlfriends by then, and Dad beamed with pride every time one of them called him Mr. Keller. Allison had started winning music competitions, and Mom would post shaky videos on Facebook with captions like, "So proud of my girl." I brought home a local history award once, placed second in a county-wide essay contest about the coal mining strikes of the 1920s, and it sat on the mantle for a week before it got replaced by a snow globe from Brian's Myrtle Beach trip. It wasn't that they hated me. They just didn't see me. And being unseen when you're trying your hardest to be real is its own kind of heartbreak. When high school hit, I tried to mold myself into what they wanted. I joined the yearbook team, tried out for JV soccer, and got benched every game. Even went to homecoming once, wearing a suit that didn't fit, holding a corsage that wilted before we even got through the door. Nothing stuck. Nothing felt right. And every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a version of myself that looked like a hostage in his own body. I started dreaming of escape. Not the dramatic kind where you run away with a guitar case and a pack of smokes, but the slow kind, where you plan your route in back issues of National Geographic and draw invisible lines on a map. I wanted to see the places no one cared about, the townspeople forgot, the roadside diners where waitresses remember your name, the motels where you fall asleep to the hum of a vending machine. When I turned 18, I didn't get a car or a cake. I got a handshake from Dad, a "don't screw up" from Brian, and a hug from Mom that lasted maybe 2 seconds too long, like she knew it would have to carry some weight. I left a month later. Said I was going to college out west. That was only partly true. I did go. For a while. But the truth is, I just needed distance. Space to figure out who I was without the weight of their expectations crushing me. I remember standing in a desert town in New Mexico 2 years later, staring at a boarded-up movie theater from the 50s and realizing I felt more at home there than I ever did in the house on Maple Hill Lane. Because there, at least, the silence made sense. It wasn't filled with disappointment or judgment. It was just quiet. People think you grow out of being the weird one. Like it's some phase you shed, like baby teeth or bad skin. But I didn't grow out of it. I grew up around it. The first time I dropped out of college, I didn't even tell anyone for 3 weeks. I kept answering texts like I was still there, still sitting in lecture halls, still trying to survive off ramen and bad coffee. In reality, I was sleeping in the back of a rusted-out Honda Civic behind a gas station 2 exits off the interstate, spending my nights watching YouTube videos about microphone technique and audio editing because somewhere deep in my gut, I had this voice screaming that I needed to build something, even if no one else thought it made sense. College hadn't felt like escape. It felt like a newer version of the same cage, one with fluorescent lighting and overpriced textbooks and endless questions about what you're going to do with your life. What I wanted to do, what I needed to do, was find a way to tell the stories that no one else seemed to care about. I didn't want to sit in a cubicle staring at spreadsheets for a company I didn't believe in, or spend 4 more years getting a degree just to end up in some polite version of the same hole my father had dug himself into. He worked his fingers raw in a machine shop and called it legacy. I wanted something else. Something that felt real. The podcast started with a borrowed mic, a used laptop, and exactly $7 in my checking account. I named it Echo Roads because the idea was simple: visit forgotten towns, record stories from locals, dig into the dusty corners of American memory that no one gave a damn about anymore. The first few episodes were rough, bad audio, choppy edits, long pauses I didn't know how to clean up. I uploaded them to a free hosting site with no real plan, just raw instinct and a gut feeling that someone, somewhere, might care. No one listened. Not at first. And when I came home for Thanksgiving that year, fresh off a month of couch surfing and gas station dinners, I made the mistake of telling them what I'd been working on. I still remember the silence at that table, the kind that's not really silent but loud in all the worst ways. Dad cleared his throat and asked if I'd found real work yet. Allison tilted her head and said it sounded fun, the same way people talk about street performers. And Brian, sitting there with a mouthful of sweet potatoes and smugness, grinned and said, "So basically, you're a hobo with a mic?" The room laughed. Even Mom chuckled. And I sat there, nodding like it was funny, because if I didn't, I might have started shouting. Or crying. Or both. They never understood that failure doesn't always look like quitting. It can look like trying every single day, without applause, without backup, without knowing if the next meal will come from a dollar menu or a stranger's kindness. I had episodes recorded in laundromats, in the back of my car, under freeway bridges with truckers passing by. I once interviewed a 93-year-old man inside an abandoned church in Missouri while raccoons scratched behind the altar. I did what I had to do. The second time I dropped out, no one even noticed. I'd re-enrolled in some online classes just to keep the student loan wolves at bay, but I never finished. I knew by then that I wasn't built for structure, not the kind they wanted anyway. I was chasing something that couldn't be scheduled between term papers and cafeteria pizza. Things started to change in the 3rd year. One episode, just one, caught fire. It was the story of a mining town in Kentucky that had disappeared off maps after a flood took out the only road in or out. I'd spent 3 nights sleeping in my car next to a shuttered gas station just to get the interviews. I cut together the episode in a public library on an old desktop that crashed twice during export. But when I uploaded it, something happened. It got picked up by a few local history blogs, then a Reddit thread, then a shout-out from a mid-sized true crime podcaster with a decent following. Within 2 weeks, my download numbers tripled. By month's end, I had my first sponsor, a travel gear company that paid in product and promised more if I hit a certain number of listeners. I hit it in 3 weeks. After that, things moved fast. More listeners, more sponsors, more towns. People started emailing me their family histories, their grandfather's war stories, old photos of one-stoplight towns that no longer existed. I got invited to speak on panels, to guest on other shows, to come tell stories at local museums. It wasn't overnight, but it was fast enough that one day I woke up in a cheap motel in Nebraska, opened my bank app, and realized I'd made over 10 grand in the last month alone. A six-figure deal was on the table from a podcast network that promised freedom and support if I kept doing what I was already doing. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt tired, because none of it changed what my family thought of me. In their eyes, I was still the dropout, still the flake, still the ghost who never quite fit the mold. I could have told them about the money, about the emails from fans saying I helped them reconnect with lost memories, or that one woman who said she played my show for her dying father every night because it reminded him of where he grew up. I could have told them that I was finally living the life I wanted, but I didn't. I didn't give them the satisfaction of deciding whether it was worthy or not. I didn't ask for praise. I didn't send updates. I showed up to holidays with polite small talk and fake smiles, letting them believe I was still drifting, still looking for myself, still that kid who never quite got it together. Let them underestimate me. Let them laugh. Because I had something better than approval. I had proof. And I had peace. But I didn't tell anyone. Not one damn soul. The thing about trust is, it doesn't usually die with a bang. It dies quietly, over time, piece by piece, like wallpaper peeling in a room no one visits anymore. But every now and then, something hits you with enough force that the entire illusion shatters at once, and when that happens, the damage isn't gradual, it's instant, total, and permanent. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in early January, when I stopped by my parents' house to drop off an early birthday gift for Mom and overheard the kind of conversation that doesn't just change your mood, it changes your blood. They weren't expecting me that day, and I didn't expect anyone to be home either. The plan was simple: leave the little wrapped photo book of old family pictures I'd made on the kitchen counter, maybe grab a soda from the garage fridge like old times, then head out. I still had 4 hours to get across state lines for an interview the next morning, and I wasn't planning to stay more than 5 minutes. The house still smelled like lemon cleaner and old baseboard heaters, the way it always had, and for a brief second, walking in the side door, I felt that tug, that sharp, bittersweet flash of what childhood used to feel like before everything got twisted into duty and silence. I was halfway to the kitchen when I heard the voices. They were coming from the dining room, not loud, but not hushed either. I froze. My father was talking, and the sound was just clear enough to make out each word. My mother responded occasionally, mostly with soft sighs and agreements, and then a third voice, male, unfamiliar, businesslike, filled in the gaps. My stomach tightened before I even knew why. "So we're looking at closing before the end of February," the man was saying. "That'll give you time to prep the property, do a basic clean-out, and find a place to land." "That should work," my dad said, voice calm, almost too calm. "As long as the wire hits in time, we can make the transfer work for Brian." My hand stopped on the kitchen counter, my knuckles turning white without me realizing it. I stood perfectly still, like if I moved, the whole house would fall on top of me. I don't know why I didn't walk in. Maybe I needed to hear it. Maybe I needed confirmation. My mom spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "We can tell Josh when it's done. No need to make a big thing about it. He's never here anyway." There it was. No need to make a big thing about it. He's never here anyway. I think that was the sentence that snapped something inside me. Because no matter how long I'd been gone, no matter how far I drifted, this house, this place, was still the root of everything. Every bruise, every laugh, every long night listening to Brian snore through the wall, every early morning pretending not to hear the fights in the kitchen. And now they were going to sell it, erase it, trade it for a temporary fix to Brian's latest screw-up without even thinking of telling me. Without even pretending I might care. I didn't storm in. I didn't confront them. I backed away slowly, like a burglar in reverse, careful not to let the screen door slam. I sat in the car, shaking slightly, and listened to the rest of the conversation through the crack in the window, long enough to catch the part about Brian's debt being a little more than expected and how family helps each other out when they need it. I hit record. I didn't know why in that moment. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe some part of me knew I was never going to get a clean explanation from them when the time came. So I recorded the last few minutes, saved it to a locked folder on my phone, and drove away without touching the soda or the photo book or the memory I'd been trying to recreate. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in a cheap motel outside Harrisburg, the walls thin enough to hear the couple fighting next door about toothpaste or infidelity or both, and I stared at the recording like it was a confession from God himself. I played it 3 times. Not because I needed proof, but because I needed to feel the weight of it, needed to soak in the confirmation that everything I'd ever suspected about my place in that family was right. They didn't forget to tell me. They chose not to. And that's the difference that changes everything. The next day, I called a lawyer I'd interviewed once for a bonus episode about small-town land disputes. I asked him how hard it would be to buy a house without the sellers knowing it was me behind the deal. He said it wasn't hard at all. A few shell companies, a trust, a straw buyer or two. As long as the money was clean and the paperwork tight, it could be done. He didn't ask why I wanted to know. Maybe he heard the cold edge in my voice. Maybe he just didn't care. Within 3 weeks, I'd made an offer. A good one. Higher than the other bids they were considering. Competitive enough to make it easy for them to say yes. The sale moved fast. They never saw my name on anything. They just thought they got lucky. I stayed quiet, even when my lawyer called to say the transfer had cleared and the house was officially mine. I didn't say a word. Not to my parents. Not to Brian. Not to Allison. Not even to the old friend who helped me do some of the back-end legwork. I kept my mouth shut, held my breath, and waited for the right time to let it all surface. Because I wasn't buying the house to save it. I was buying it to end it. The silence that followed the recording didn't just hang in the air, it buried itself into the bones of the room, soaked into the seams of the booth, and pulsed with every heartbeat like a warning that no one was ready to hear. I could feel the tension rolling off their bodies like heat waves on blacktop, and for a moment no one dared move, like any sudden shift might snap the fragile thread holding the last shred of civility together. My mother stared at the napkin in her lap like it might explain what she'd just heard. Her lips trembled around the shape of a sentence she couldn't finish, and her eyes were already rimmed in red, filling fast with the kind of tears that come not from sadness, but from confusion, embarrassment, and the terrifying realization that maybe you raised someone you don't actually know at all. My father was the first to speak, and he didn't even bother trying to soften it. His voice cracked like gravel under steel-toed boots, and his face twisted into something between fury and disappointment, an expression I'd known so well growing up that it used to haunt my sleep. "This is how you do it?" he asked, not yelling, but loud enough to pull the attention of a waiter 2 tables over. "You sneak behind your family's back like some little corporate snake, then spring it on us like it's a damn birthday present?" My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. Because I'd already lived this moment 100 times in my head, and in every version, he reacted exactly like this, with anger that masked fear, and pride that couldn't stand the taste of its own reflection. I leaned back slowly, letting the silence settle again before I answered, knowing full well that words only matter when they're held like a blade. "No," I said calmly, locking eyes with him across the table. "This is how I take back something that was mine to begin with." Mom's hand reached across the table, but it wasn't toward me. It was to gently touch my father's wrist like she was grounding him, keeping him from doing or saying something worse. She looked at me then, her voice almost a whisper, brittle as dry leaves. "We didn't mean to leave you out, Josh," she said, blinking fast. We thought it was better not to involve you. You always seemed so far away, so busy with all your," she hesitated, like the word she wanted was still under construction. Projects. I nodded once, slow and deliberate, like a man reading the verdict he already knew was coming. You didn't leave me out by accident, I said. You left me out because I've always been the one you didn't understand, and instead of trying, you just filed me under not reliable and moved on. Brian, who'd been quiet too long, finally spoke, and as expected, he came in swinging with the maturity of a cinder block. Jesus, man, he said, loud enough to draw another glance from a couple at the bar. You're making this about you? You went behind everyone's back and bought the damn house just to prove some petty point. I turned to him slowly, and my voice was ice wrapped in velvet. No, I said. I bought the house because you were trying to sell it to pay off your gambling debts, and no one thought I was worth telling. That's not a petty point, Brian. That's a survival instinct. He opened his mouth to fire back, but I kept going, louder this time, letting the truth cut through his noise like a scalpel. You want to talk betrayal? How about the fact that you've been bailed out more times than I can count, and the one time you couldn't wiggle out of it, Mom and Dad were ready to sell off our family's house without even picking up the phone to ask me how I felt about it. Brian's jaw twitched, and he looked like he wanted to throw something. Maybe a punch, maybe another half-truth, but even he knew there wasn't much ground to stand on. My father's face turned a shade darker, the vein in his temple pulsing like it wanted to speak for him. You could have come to us, he said through gritted teeth. You could have said something before all this, instead of turning it into a goddamn performance. I laughed low and humorless, because if that wasn't the most predictable line I'd ever heard from him, I didn't know what was. Oh, come to you? I said, leaning forward now, eyes locked on his. Like when I came to you after I dropped out of college the first time, and you told me I was wasting your money and your name. Or when I came home that Thanksgiving and tried to talk about the podcast, and Brian made a joke and you laughed harder than I'd ever seen. Come to you like that? He didn't answer. None of them did. So I kept going because if I stopped now, it would feel like I still needed permission to speak, and I didn't. Not anymore. I don't care about the house, I said. Not in the way you think. I care about the fact that every corner of that place holds a memory I wasn't allowed to value. I care that you tried to erase me from a home I helped build just because I didn't fit the story you wanted to tell your friends at church or the neighbors at cookouts. I took a breath, then delivered the line I'd been holding in my chest like a loaded gun. The house is mine now, I said, letting the words land like a hammer. And the way I see it, y'all owe rent. My mother gasped softly. Brian swore under his breath. My father stared at me like he'd just seen the ghost of a man he never took the time to know. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I didn't plan to hand it to them at the dinner table, not originally at least, but something in the way they all looked at me after I said the word rent made it clear that if I didn't do it then, I never would. There was this expression frozen on my father's face, not anger anymore, not even pride, but something deeper, older, like the stunned silence of a man realizing he's lived long enough to watch the world shape itself around the people he underestimated. My mother was blinking fast, trying to hold back tears without smearing her makeup, and Brian was still posturing in his chair, arms crossed like a sulking teenager, jaw tight like he was chewing on a grudge. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope, not sealed, not fancy, just paper holding paper, and slid it across the table like a magician revealing the last card in a trick no one saw coming. It sat there for a moment between the half-eaten plates and the untouched bread basket, humming with the kind of weight that only comes from choices that can't be undone. It's a lease, I said quietly, but not softly. 1 year. Standard terms. No discounts. No special treatment. You've got 60 days to decide. After that, we'll need to start looking at other options. My mother gasped like I'd slapped her, both hands flying to her chest, and her eyes widened like she thought she might still be dreaming. Josh, she whispered, her voice cracking on the second syllable, you can't. You wouldn't. This is our home. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second, I almost caved. There's something about the way a mother pleads that can make even the hardest decisions wobble, like maybe the ground beneath them isn't as solid as it seemed a moment ago. But I remembered that phone call. I remembered sitting in that parking lot, listening to her calmly talk about selling the house to help Brian, never once mentioning my name, never once asking herself whether I might care, whether I might need that place too. I can, I said. And I would. And I am. Brian stood so fast his chair scraped the floor, loud enough to make the couple at the next table look up in alarm. He pointed at me with the kind of shaky finger that usually precedes a punch, but this time he didn't have the nerve or maybe just didn't have the energy. "You're out of your damn mind," he said, louder than necessary. "You really think you can hold this over us like some kind of power play? What, you want us to bow down and thank you? Is that it?" I didn't respond. I just looked at him like I was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. He'd always been the golden son, the confident one, the guy who could talk his way out of a traffic ticket while I sat in the back of the room wondering if anyone knew I existed. And now here he was, red-faced and flailing, finally realizing that the rules had changed and he wasn't the one holding the remote anymore. Brian shook his head and grabbed his coat, muttering something under his breath that I didn't catch, but didn't need to. He didn't even look at my parents as he stormed past them, and a minute later we heard the heavy slam of the restaurant door behind him. My mother flinched like it was a gunshot. Then, quiet. For what felt like a full minute, no one said anything. The kind of silence that fills every corner of a room, wraps itself around your neck, and dares you to breathe wrong. My father sat still, staring at the lease like it was a riddle he didn't know how to solve. His hands were clasped in front of him on the table, weathered and scarred from decades of factory work, but perfectly still. I waited for him to say something, anything. Maybe a curse, maybe a threat, maybe just a question. But all he did was sit there, and that silence, that goddamn silence, said more than any speech ever could. My mother, finally breaking, reached across the table and touched my wrist gently. "Please," she said, barely louder than the hum of the overhead lights. "This isn't who you are. You're not cruel." I looked at her, and for a split second, I wasn't 30 anymore. I was 8 years old again, sitting on the porch with scraped knees, waiting for someone to come find me. And like always, no one ever did. "I'm not being cruel," I said, standing slowly. "I'm being fair. This house means something to me too. And if the only way to make you all see that is with paperwork and legal terms, then so be it." I picked up my coat, slipping one arm in, then the other. I felt their eyes on me, heavy and bewildered, like I'd turned into someone they'd never met. But the truth was, I hadn't changed. I'd just stopped apologizing. As I stepped back from the table, I paused for one last moment, my hand resting on the chair I'd occupied just minutes earlier. "It didn't have to be like this," I said, voice low, almost to myself. "But you made your choices. And now, so have I." Then I walked out. The night air hit me like a slap, sharp and cold, but cleansing in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't look back. Didn't wait to see if they'd call after me or chase me down in the parking lot. I just kept walking toward the car, each step steadier than the last, my breath coming easier with every foot of distance I put between us. I sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. The windows fogged slightly as the heater kicked in, but I didn't wipe them clean. I let the blur stay. Some things are clearer when seen through a little fog. I don't know if they'll sign the lease. I don't know if we'll ever sit at the same table again. Maybe they'll hate me for this. Maybe they'll finally understand. Was I cruel? Maybe. But for once, I was finally heard.